Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, leftists, progressives, liberals, and social activists and sports fans, and welcome to another edition of Not Another Sports Show, NASRadicalSports.com, a radical look at the world of sports. Our show is available for broadcast on college and community radio stations, low-power FM stations, and any of the over 180 stations of the Pacifica Radio Network. If you can't listen live or you happen to miss any of today's show, you can get access by subscribing to our podcast feed on iTunes, Stitcher, or the Google Play Store. Entire editions of our broadcast are also available at NASRadicalSports.com. Send us your feedback, your thoughts about program coverage, ideas for future shows, and updates to @NASRadSports on Twitter, Facebook.com/NASRadicalSports, NASRadicalSports@gmail.com, or the NASRadicalSports.com contact page. We were off last week, but we are back ready to talk about a whole lot of sports and politics. And we want to send some big props out to Colin Martin of the Minnesota United in Major League Soccer for coming out during the team's Pride Night and being the second openly gay player in the history of Major League Soccer, as well as solidarity shown to the Swedish World Cup team, who, just as we go on air, lost to England in the quarterfinals, but they pushed back against some racist and xenophobic nonsense after one of their players, Jimmy Dermaz, got racist insults after his foul gave the Germans a free kick to win a match in group play. And Dermaz was talking about the racist abuse that he had, and the team collectively decided to film a short video where collectively they got together and they all spoke about the racist abuse, and then at the end, they all collectively said F racism, except they actually said the actual word, which is not radio-friendly. We also want to send some big props out to the journalist, especially Julia Garmaraes, who told off a guy who tried to kiss her while she was filming a World Cup broadcast in Russia. And this is the third kind of instance of this stuff happening, and it's really incredibly problematic that journalists should be able to do their jobs without facing this kind of gendered nonsense and gendered violence. That people wouldn't do this to their male counterparts, and it's really bad, and it's really offensive, and it's really stupid when it happens in multiple instances. This is at least the third one during this World Cup that it's happened. This isn't funny, it's not awe, it's not celebrating, it's really disgusting. And we have a whole lot to talk about from the last week and a half or so of sports. And one of the things is that a lot of this show today is going to be focused on a nexus involving gendered violence in sport, as a lot of the stories that came out this week and this past week had to really do with a lot of that. And recognizing that I am a cishet male, aged 18 to death, recognizing that I don't necessarily have the best worldview or the best experience with a lot of those things, that I can't really talk as authoritatively. We did try to get some guests lined up for the broadcast. Unfortunately, due to some scheduling issues, those guests were not able to join us in studio or join us for an interview. So, recognizing that I am a cishet guy, aged 18 to death, I am going to do my best, recognizing that, yeah, it might sound a little mansplaining at times, but recognizing also the fact, as Sir Patrick Stewart once noted, it seems that we only listen to old white men, so I'm going to use my status as an old white man to get people to listen to about certain issues. So, running with that segment, we are going to get started talking about a whole host of political sports news, starting this week in pro football. In pro football news, allegations that Jameis Winston groped an Uber driver in 2016 have been found to be validated by the league, and he has been suspended 3 games for it. He was out that evening with Brandon Banks and Ronald Darby, 2 names which may be familiar to longtime listeners of this show and longtime sports fans, as Brandon Banks is the guy who was one of the Vanderbilt players convicted of sexual assault charges and is in the midst of serving a 15-year prison sentence for it, as well as Ronald Darby being the player that had Jameis Winston's back and supported him and defended him during his allegations at Florida State involving a sexual assault there when he was quarterback. Well, Banks came forward and said that there wasn't just one Uber trip that Jameis Winston originally had said that there was, and that the Uber driver got things mixed up, that the Uber trip she must have been thinking about was when the three of them were in the car together. Banks instead said that there was a second trip, and that the NFL never reached out to him just because he asked to have his lawyer present. There was a second trip, and that is the one that the Uber driver had mentioned, where Jameis Winston had allegedly grabbed her crotch and groped her. The NFL gave out a 3-game suspension. 3 games. 3. This is 1 fewer games than was given out to Tom Brady over allegations of deflating footballs. It's 1 more game than they gave to Ray Rice for an act of domestic violence that was caught on videotape. It's 2 more games than they gave to the former New York Giants kicker, who was alleged to have been engaged in a campaign of harassment against his wife. This is fewer games than given out to marijuana and PED punishments. And Jameis Winston issued a statement about this. And, of course, the big issue is that Jameis Winston has agreed not to appeal. That is the reason that this is a 3-game suspension. That he has agreed not to appeal. That's the issue here. NFL got what they wanted, which is a suspension and an agreement not to appeal and not to drag this out forward and see what the NFL's investigation was like and what the NFL was involved with, because we've seen as the investigations go forward with the former place kicker for the New York Giants or some of the more recent cases that the NFL's investigations are really not all that fantastic, and they wanted to avoid a lot of that coming forward. So Jameis Winston issued a statement after he was suspended for his 3 games and that announcement came down, saying, quote, "The NFL informed me today that I will be suspended for the first 3 games of the season. First and foremost, I would like to say I'm sorry to the Uber driver for the position I put you in. It is uncharacteristic of me, and I genuinely apologize. In the past 2.5 years, my life has been filled with experiences, opportunities, and events that have helped me grow, mature, and learn, including the fact that I have eliminated alcohol from my life. I know I have to hold myself to a higher standard on and off the field, and that I have a responsibility to my family, community, and teammates to live above the platform with which God has blessed me. I apologize to my teammates, the Buccaneers organization, and fans for letting them down and for not being able to be out there for the first 3 games of the season. Although I am disappointed in the NFL's decision, I understand the NFL's process, and I embrace this as an opportunity to take advantage of the resources available to help me achieve the goals that I have for myself. I now look forward to putting this behind me, and I will continue to work hard every day to be a positive influence in my community and be the best person, teammate, and leader I can be." Well, let's take this statement apart. The position that you put the driver in. You're sorry for the position that you put the driver in. How about we look at what position you put the driver in? That night while you were drunk, you were yelling homophobic slurs out of your car at random passerbys, and then had allegedly grabbed the driver's crotch. When this story came out, Jameis Winston stated that the driver was confused about the amount of people in the car. But now that was shown not to be actually accurate, and there was a second Uber attempt, and there was a second Uber trip, that this suddenly gets left out. And according to NFL.com's reporter Tom Pelissero, Winston specifically refused to apologize for anything specific in this because he doesn't believe it actually happened. Except he doesn't know for sure because he had been drinking so much. That's incredibly problematic. He doesn't believe it actually happened, but he doesn't know because he had been drinking so much. That didn't stop him from immediately denying it when these allegations first came out, when he had said that she was the one who was wrong because she forgot how many people were in the car. He apparently then couldn't remember how many trips there were in an Uber, if we're going to believe his original argument. But once that argument came down, then it's, I apologize for the position that I put you in, because either he was too blackout drunk to remember doing it, or he doesn't believe that it actually happened and therefore is not going to take responsibility, which is something that we've seen very, very frequently with allegations involving Jameis Winston going back to Florida State, where there's not really taking a whole lot of responsibility or not really a whole lot of consequences coming from it. Saying that it's uncharacteristic of him, no, I think it's entirely characteristic with what we've heard, like the Florida State sexual assault allegations, the theft of crab legs from the grocery store, or the outright immaturity of yelling a profane internet meme on top of a cafeteria table. And I understand, 18, 19, 20, you tend to do stupid stuff. I understand that. 18, 19 or so, you tend to do dumb things. But when you're put on a platform of being a quarterback for a major school in Division I, you have a lot more scrutiny being put upon you, where you don't really get the opportunity to go get blackout drunk or yell profane things and be immature. That, right or wrong, you don't have that kind of opportunity. And when we've seen denials and refusals of any kind of real consequences to come down, and complete decisions to not have any kind of responsibility for a series of allegations, these fit in characteristically with what we've seen. And it says something that a team like the Tampa Bay Buccaneers was still willing to draft you given all of those issues. And then talking about getting rid of alcohol. Well, great. Hooray for you. But alcohol doesn't force people to do things. Alcohol doesn't force anybody to do anything. Alcohol doesn't put your hands on other people. Alcohol doesn't yell homophobic slurs. Alcohol doesn't do any of those things. And did the alcohol cause you to deny any wrongdoing until you couldn't deny it any further? Was that alcohol's fault too? The guy, of course, who vouched for Jameis Winston at the start and covered for him was Ronald Darby. The same Ronald Darby who helped cover and vouch for him during the allegations of sexual assault at Florida State. The lawyer for the driver said it appears that Darby's texts showed that Winston was, quote, that Darby was, quote, still outside the club as the Uber ride was finishing, close quote. And it appears that Darby either didn't know about the second ride and could have went all supportive for Jameis, based on thinking that the driver was talking about the first one. That's one possible option. It could be that he was misled by Jameis and his friend lied to him. Or it could be that he was actively covering for Jameis Winston. We won't know for sure, but those are some of the options that are available. Now, the NFL is not releasing the letter that it sent to Winston to announce the suspension, which would talk about the details in their investigation. Jameis denies doing any of this, and if he did it, he doesn't remember doing it because he was boozed out of his skull. And the most important thing for the NFL here, he agreed not to appeal. And if you're like me, you probably remember the 6-game minimum penalty that was announced by Roger Goodell. Well, we don't see a 6-game minimum penalty here because he agreed not to go and he agreed not to appeal this case. And so he was willing to take a lesser punishment. And in the NFL's mind, hey, we punished this guy ever so slightly, and none of our really horrendous involvement in any kind of investigations need to come forward. We don't need to show our work. We don't need to show details, because no one really trusts the NFL in having any kind of proper basis to investigate any of this. No one has any faith and trust in the NFL for doing this. But again, when they say it's a 6-game minimum and then they're willing to accept 3 after giving a 1-game suspension to another guy, the NFL wants to be seen very often as doing the right thing and making go and being seen as that way, and then hoping that, in a few days everything goes away. And that's what this 3-game suspension really feels like. That because he's not going to appeal, because he's not going to drag this out, eventually it will just go away. And they think that we aren't going to be bothered by it. They think that we're still going to tune in and watch games. They think that we're still going to tune in and be fans, while not really addressing this issue in any kind of really serious, substantive fashion. Meanwhile, the former Carolina Panthers owner, Jerry Richardson, was fined $2.75 million for, quote, allegations of improper workplace conditions, close quote. The team was recently sold for $2.275 billion to hedge fund manager David Tepper. Allegations about the now 81-year-old owner, Jerry Richardson, include asking women to turn around on Jeans Day so he could admire them, asking them things like, "Show me how you wiggle to get those jeans up. I bet you had to lay down on your bed to fit into those jeans. Did you step into those jeans or did you have to jump into them?" And also asking if he could shave women employees' legs. He also allegedly would invite women for lunch and insist on fastening their seatbelt, where he could then brush across their upper body. Other allegations said that he would give back rubs that, quote, lingered too long or went too low down the spine, or asked for foot rubs from a female employee. How would you think any of this is appropriate in the workplace? How would you think that at all? And this is one of the billionaire owners. And the only reason this got dealt with is because the investigation came out and he was already thinking about wanting to get out of owning this team. And so the NFL wants to be seen as doing the right thing. So they push him out and then fine him a slap on the wrist penalty in dealing with this issue. And of course, whether or not the NFL is actually going to sit on this and see if very real workplace benefits and workplace fixes and workplace changes are going to happen, who knows? Because the NFL largely likes to be seen as doing the right thing, not necessarily actually doing it. You've been listening to Not Another Sports Show, NASRadicalSports.com, a radical look at sports. We've just been talking about the NFL's latest fumble in some really serious matters with the handling of the Jameis Winston suspension, that he gets 3 games so they can help get this one to go away, that they want to be seen as doing the right thing and making sure that their investigations aren't shown to be completely morally bankrupt and morally corrupt, as well as the league finding the now former Panthers owner for some really cringeworthy and disgusting workplace behavior. Coming up, we'll be talking about baseball trying redemptive narratives for poor behavior without acknowledgement of wrongdoing, and we're going to jump right in to baseball news. In baseball news, we are going to talk about the Kansas City Royals for a while. The Kansas City Royals are thinking of signing pitcher Luke Heimlich from Oregon State. Heimlich pled guilty to molestation of a family member when he was 15 years old. He has been eligible to be drafted the last 2 Major League Baseball drafts, and no team has drafted him in either one of those drafts due to this guilty plea of molestation. Heimlich has not admitted wrongdoing. He has not admitted regret. He has not admitted an apology for any of this. His belief is that he simply pled guilty to try to make this thing go away, not necessarily that he actually did it. Well, the general manager of the Kansas City Royals, Dayton Moore, is now apparently wanting to sign Heimlich. He talked about having, quote, second chances, and that Heimlich, quote, earned, close quote, a second chance. He also talked about how the team was involved in giving second chances to players, and he mentioned Jared Dyson. Now, Jared Dyson and Luke Heimlich are, yes, they're both baseball players, but to compare what they had done and gotten nailed for is completely and totally inappropriate. Jared Dyson used performance-enhancing drugs and got suspended for it. Luke Heimlich pled guilty to sexually violating a family member. Not even close. Not even remotely the same thing. Moore then said that he was taken out of context, and going back and rereading the interviews, no, we pretty much got the context right. You mentioned Dayton Moore You mentioned Jared Dyson in this Dayton Moore, talking about how you gave him a second chance for being popped for PED usage, and then tried to equate that to giving a second chance here to Luke Heimlich. That's the issue. And he said that the national media doesn't really know what's in his heart. And that's certainly true. We don't know. We don't have ESP to know exactly what's in his heart. But we can say it's a really bad look when you're trying to equate someone who's been nailed for using steroids and performance-enhancing drugs and getting a second chance to play baseball as anywhere near the moral equivalent of someone who pled guilty to sexually abusing a young family member. And this is the same team that has also taken the very, very reactionary right-wing narrative of being anti-pornography. They've made players attend workshops on pornography being dangerous and pornography being a problem. In some of these workshops that were put on by groups like the group Fight the New Drug, they've linked pornography to domestic violence. They're blaming porn for people getting addicted and contributing to rape and a whole host of other social problems. Yet, of course, there is no causation data to prove any of those points. There is no causal data to show that porn is causing domestic violence or porn is causing people to get addicted or contributing to sexual assault. There is no basis and no data for any of those puritanical points, but it hasn't stopped groups like this from going out and trumpeting it and Dayton Moore from making his players have to sit in these kinds of things. Now, if you want to discuss an idea that porn may lead to exploitative views about women, then certainly that's a discussion that can be had. That's certainly a discussion that can be had. But I'd also argue that there's other things causing exploitative and objectifying values and views of women that are a whole lot more commonplace than porn. That there's a whole lot of things that are a lot more exploitative and a lot more objectifying than pornography that aren't getting the mandatory team workshops about it. The entire system of capitalism, for instance, is set up to be exploitative and objectifying of women as well as all workers. It's set up to be exploitative of us, to take our labor and give it to people for money, and then we aren't given the full value of what we create. That part of that money is taken off in forms of profit. That it objectifies, it exploits us, and it does that to women and other groups much more severely and much more significantly and in a variety of ways. And that's a whole lot more commonplace than going after pornography with this puritanical viewpoint. Now, you can make arguments, of course, about the courts and how the court structures and the justice system in cases is problematic at points. You can make those arguments, but Dayton Moore is not making any of those kinds of arguments. He isn't talking about what the team could do to help Heimlich if they did draft him and making sure that he stayed on the quote-unquote straight and narrow. They're not talking about any of that. They're simply saying that he deserves a second chance and that he has earned one without explaining what he did to earn a second chance, that this is simply trying to be a redemptive narrative because he's really good at pitching. He's really good at throwing a ball. And this isn't to say that he should never be employed anywhere. That's not what this is. We're not going to have, the job ops to prevent Luke Heimlich from ever getting employed. But you don't necessarily have a right to be a multi-millionaire playing for a Major League Baseball franchise when you've engaged in these kind of behaviors. And Dayton Moore trying to take reactionary positions on a number of issues while then trying to sign players who have pled guilty to really horrific things and not really seeming to admit any kind of wrongdoing or apologizing or regret about it. That's incredibly and disturbingly problematic. And the arguments that could be made about how they could help Heimlich or the issues involving the courts and the justice system are not the arguments that Dayton Moore is making. Dayton Moore is simply trying to push a redemptive narrative to make sure that there's space where they could possibly sign this player. Meanwhile, the Detroit Tigers announced that they have fired pitching coach Chris Bosio for quote-unquote insensitive comments. Bosio claims that he called Tigers pitcher Daniel Stumpf a, quote, spider monkey, close quote, and that a black attendant overheard it and thought that the monkey reference was directed at him. Well, The Athletic interviewed 4 other sources, and those 4 other sources all say that's not actually what happened. According to them, Bosio was mad about a pitcher, and in being mad about this pitcher, motioned towards the black attendant and said, quote, like this monkey here, close quote, and called the black attendant a monkey. And 4 other sources have claimed that's actually what happened, whereas Bosio said that he had called the pitcher, Daniel Stumpf, a spider monkey because that's his nickname. Well, when the Detroit Free Press asked Stumpf, is your nickname Spider Monkey? Stumpf was very confused and said that he was not aware that that was his nickname at all. This is really problematic. Not only, you make these kinds of insensitive comments, and then you backpedal and you backpedal and you backpedal and you backpedal and say that you didn't make it and that it was someone else being overly sensitive. Well, we've seen this happen in and outside of the sports world, where essentially white people are using 911, for instance, as customer service. Whenever there's a person of color who's engaged in completely legal behavior, people are using 911 almost as customer service to go address an issue. Like the guy who was eating on the BART train and another passenger called the police to deal with a guy who was eating on the train. Or Pool Patrol Pete is the most recent one to go viral, asking a woman at her own apartment complex to show an ID for using the pool, even though she had a pool pass that let her into the locked gate area. Or, of course, we can go back to Oakland and the barbecue, or we can go to San Francisco. Like, the fact that I can sit here and name off instant after instant after instant after instant after instant shows that this kind of behavior of white people either doing or saying racist things and trying to weaponize the sensitivity of others against them when they're engaged in overtly racist behavior and get called out on it, and try to weaponize that they're being too sensitive to address it, is a very real challenge, and it's a very real problem where people want to engage in this kind of racist behavior. When then they get called out on it, they try to backpedal and fall apart and backpedal, or come up with really bad allegations where 4 other sources, of course, all say that that didn't happen. Now, the Twins manager, another old school manager, Ron Gardenhire, got asked about it and said, quote, I think this has been a reality check for everybody that, hey, we're not going to stand for this anymore. We've got to get this out of our lives and treat each other with respect. This has been going on, and it's probably overdue, and it needs to be pushed even harder, close quote. And that went back to Bosio talking about how there's fat jokes and those sorts of things being made in the clubhouse and in the locker room. And yeah, there's a part of locker room culture, and there's a part of just being friends with people and stuff where you start ragging on them and you start, goofing around, and you're able to say certain things with people who are your friends because they know you're not actively mean-spirited about it. That was not the case in this incident. That didn't really seem to be the case at all. It seemed to just be using racialized language and then trying to backpedal and make up a statement that no one else was willing to back up for you. That's the issue here. That's the very real problem here. And we have to push back against this kind of racialized language. We have to push back against this kind of overt racism and the inside the sports world and outside of the sports world of white people using 911 and the police almost as customer service to go address issues with people of color just engaged in perfectly fine legal behavior. That's a very real problem that you're not entitled to essentially be policing over the bodies of people of color and using the police to try to make that happen. we're going to shift to some unpaid college sports news. And Tyler Hilinski, the former Washington State quarterback who had committed suicide in January, the family came forward this last week and announced that they had an autopsy done and testing of his brain, and announced that their son, Tyler Hilinski, the former college quarterback, was suffering from chronic traumatic encephalopathy at the time of his death. Chronic traumatic encephalopathy is a trauma-induced brain disorder which has been connected to a whole host of issues of depression, anxiety, and personality changes. And they noted that he had the, quote, brain of a 65-year-old, close quote, due to the damage that he had suffered. He did not play a single down in the NFL. He was still in college. He had played in high school, and he had played in college, and that was it. That's not very much football. And there used to be the phrase about, Dad, should I play football or play boxing? And it was, well, nobody plays boxing. Well, I don't think you can even say that about football anymore. That playing football is almost like smoking a smaller cigarette. And you can go back and listen to our interview that we did with Patrick Ruby about the NCAA and their legal obligations to actually try to deal with this, as well as their moral obligations to try to deal with any of this. That going back to the 1930s, the NCAA knew that being hit in the head was a problem, that players should be sitting out, and that players should be taken out of games if there was a idea that they were actually hurt. That was going back to the 1930s. And yet the NCAA has not seen fit to go forward with any kind of major rules or major demands requesting that all schools follow certain protocols, because either they're too scared or they actively want to avoid any kind of legal responsibility for this. This is the same NCAA who has no problem enforcing all sorts of Byzantine ridiculous rules to keep players broke, but when it comes to protecting the brains inside their skulls, all of a sudden they're powerless and they can't do anything about the member institutions, and they can't address it, or they won't address it. That the NCAA is a thoroughly morally bankrupt organization, in the fact that we have the prioritization of keeping the players broke over the protection of their brains. Meanwhile, former athletic director Ian McCaw at Baylor University testified in depositions for lawyers representing the 10 alleged sexual assault cases that came at Baylor. Former athletic director McCaw talked about a, quote, Enron cover-up scheme, close quote, and that the school had, quote, an elaborate plan that essentially scapegoated black football players and the football program for being responsible for what was a decades-long university-wide sexual assault scandal, close quote. He says that the Regents tried to make it, quote, skewed to make the football program look bad and cover up the campus-wide failings, close quote. He also says that former Baylor Police Chief Jim Doak discouraged reporting. Now, I'm stuck in a situation where I don't trust Baylor at all. I have no trust and no faith in Baylor at all to believe anything that comes forward, especially after they never actually had a report commissioned by Pepper Hamilton that was written down because they didn't want people getting their hands on the report through public records requests. They didn't take notes at the Pepper Hamilton meetings because they didn't want to give up those information to public records requests. So I'm stuck in a situation where Baylor has no trust, no faith to believe a single thing that comes out of their heads. But a guy who sat with this and is only speaking out now after losing his job and being at the head of the section with multiple athletes getting popped for sexual assault allegations without much action, can't really be trusted very much here either. That it's not really an elaborate plan to scapegoat the football players in the football program, when there's multiple founded instances of it happening. There's multiple founded instances within the university structure, there's founded instances, and even going to the courts, there's founded instances of it. as multiple Baylor football players were found to be guilty of sexual assault. That this isn't necessarily a cover-up scheme to make one thing look bad at Enron, this Enron-style cover-up. To skew this to make the football program look bad to cover up campus-wide failings isn't really accurate. Yeah, it may have involved a number of football players, but the fact that they didn't really address it because they put out a winning football team is a campus-wide failing. It's not one or the other here, it's both. It's not skewed to make the program look bad, it's that the program looks bad because they had a number of players involved in this kind of behavior, to the point where it was founded in a number of complaints inside the university system as well as in the courts. And the fact that those went unaddressed for a while, or very, very quiet for a while, makes the entire campus-wide failings completely the issue. No one's saying that it's skewed just solely to the football team. This was a university-wide failing in the aspect of not addressing this issue, and a number of those people happen to be players. And so McCaw, to try to absolve himself of this, is incredibly problematic. Meanwhile, at Ohio State, a number of former wrestlers have come forward alleging sexual abuse going back from the 1970s into the early 1990s, with a number of former wrestlers alleging that a former team doctor, Richard Strauss, had groped them and sexually abused them. They're also alleging that there were major institutional failures among the school and the coaches who failed to stop the abuse. One of these coaches was the now powerful representative from the state of Ohio, Jim Jordan, who was an assistant coach from 1986 to 1994. And this is at the relative tail end of Dr. Strauss's time at Ohio State, where, yeah, it's certainly right to blame Jordan for an alleged lack of action, but this is also towards the end of Strauss's career, and we can also look institutionally at Ohio State and the lack of action, as a number of people had talked about how it was common knowledge what Dr. Strauss was doing. Representative Jordan has denied that he knew anything, but wrestlers allege that it was, quote, common knowledge, close quote, that inappropriate behavior was happening. And we can certainly lay some of the responsibility at Representative Jordan's feet if he happened to know about something and chose inaction on these issues. But we can also then take that same argument and lay it at the hands of the institutions of Ohio State, because prior to 1986, Jim Jordan wasn't there. And we can look at Ohio State and those kind of institutional structures as well as what's happening with Representative Jordan. One of the wrestlers said about Representative Jordan, quote, at the end of the day, he is absolutely lying if he says he doesn't know what was going on, close quote. The head wrestling coach said that he had told the school about the doctor and that he had warned the players. After 3 wrestlers came out, a 4th one came forward to say that it was, quote, widely known, close quote, about the abuse. Donald Trump, of course, has supported Jordan, and that's because Representative Jordan is a member of the quote-unquote Freedom Caucus, and he's one of the most conservatives in Congress. Trump said, quote, I don't believe them at all. I believe him. Jim Jordan is one of the most outstanding people I've met since I've been in Washington. I believe him 100%, close quote. Well, of course, Trump has his own allegations about sexual assault being levied against him by a number of women that he is now refusing to believe as well. So the fact that Donald Trump's not wanting to believe people who are alleging sexual assault claims and sexual harassment claims and sexual groping claims is not a shock to me at all in the slightest. Well, then a 5th wrestler, former UFC champ Mark Coleman, came forward talking about how he is a friend of Representative Jordan, but, quote, there's no way, unless he's got dementia or something, that he's got no recollection of what was going on at Ohio State. I have nothing but respect for this man. I love this man, but he knew as far as I'm concerned, close quote. Well, Representative Jordan went on the offensive. He went on the Fox News Paste-Eating Hour with Brett Baier and claimed that some of the accusers were mad at the school over past business deals that failed, and alleged that one of the wrestlers had a, quote, criminal record, but there was no evidence of that criminal record coming forward on the one that he alleged about. Jordan then gave this really odd, meandering answer that said, quote, conversations in the locker room are a lot different than allegations of abuse or reported abuse to us, Conversations in the locker room are a lot different than people coming up talking about abuse. No one ever reported any abuse to me. If they had, I would have dealt with it. Close quote. What? Because they didn't formally come to you and say something to you means that you had no idea? Because they didn't formally say something to you means you had no clue. Now, this is going to sound really snarky, but you have these two things on the side of your head, and they're called ears. If you're hearing conversations in the locker room about this, you have the ability to listen and then follow up on the allegations with those people, because not everybody's really comfortable going to their assistant coach and saying, hey, this is a thing. Because, of course, this doctor had been in place for a number of years before Representative Jordan was an assistant coach at Ohio State, and nothing had gotten done to address this through institutional failures about these allegations. So, to say that conversations in the locker room are a lot different than reported abuse, yeah, that's a small difference, but if you heard those things and you heard about them and you knew the scuttlebutt and you didn't do anything, that's an institutional failure. Being inactive and pleading incompetence is not a defense. It's not a defense to say that you were incompetent and didn't do anything. And being inactive, that's not a defense in this. He also alleged that he didn't hear any of these conversations in the locker room to avoid this issue. This is, just splitting hairs after splitting hairs after splitting hairs of, I had no idea about this. Okay, there was conversations in the locker room, but I didn't hear any of those conversations in the locker room. We're doing this meandering dance over this. And yeah, it's certainly right to, again, raise some responsibility for Jordan in this if he had known about these issues, as a number of wrestlers are claiming he did happen to know. But we also have to look institutionally at Ohio State, because these instances of sexual abuse were allegedly happening long before Jordan got on the job. And that's not saying that we absolve Jordan of all responsibility. No, we certainly hold his feet to the fire, and if he is responsible, then nailing him for it, but also looking institutionally at Ohio State and why nothing was done if this was quote-unquote common knowledge. You're listening to Not Another Sports Show, NASRadicalSports.com, a radical look at sports. We've just been talking about front office staff trying to have redemptive narratives for people who haven't earned them. Coming up, we'll be talking about a really simple idea that I can't believe we still have to say when Asian countries are successful, as well as the next big UFC fight not being in the octagon, and then, of course, our happy news for the week. So we're going to move into our last segment of the show, This Week in Other Sports News. After Mexico made it out of group play thanks to the efforts of South Korea beating Germany, Mexico was very, very happy. A number of their fans were, of course, also very, very happy. On Telemundo, one co-host was yelling, quote, "I want to take a knee and say thank you to the Virgin of Korea. I beg every Mexican to go and celebrate at a Korean restaurant, consume their products, kiss them, hug them, marry them, give them green cards, whatever. Long live Korea. Yes, sir." Okay, that's funny. That's some amusing stuff. Yeah, that's just good-hearted celebration. But two co-hosts then did the slanty-eyed pose on television. They got suspended and they apologized, saying they made a mistake and they made an inappropriate, insensitive gesture towards the Asian community. It was a lack of sensitivity on my part. I admit that I did something wrong and I wanted to apologize to anyone who was offended by it. It's 2018. Can we just stop with the slanty-eyed pose now, please? Like, already? Can we just stop? Meanwhile, FIFA issued some more slap-on-the-wrist penalties to teams engaged in nationalist political behavior and neo-Nazi behavior. $10,100 was fined to Russia's Soccer Federation after a World Cup match against Uruguay had a neo-Nazi banner in the crowd. And Serbia was fined $20,200 for their banner celebrating the Chetniks, which were a World War II nationalist organization. Oh, FIFA, do you realize that just giving slap-on-the-wrist penalties is not going to change very much? Meanwhile, in Olympics news, Austria's Communist Party has gotten enough petition signatures to put a referendum on the ballot about potentially banning the city of Graz from hosting the 2026 Olympics. Innsbruck previously said no via a referendum, and 2 Swiss cities have already said no via a referendum as well. And so the city of Graz may join them in saying no to hosting the Olympics in 2026. So solidarity there to the Austrian activists who are working to keep the Olympics out. In some happy news in hockey, congratulations to Willie O'Ree for making it into the NHL's Hall of Fame. He had famously integrated the NHL on January 18th, 1958. And while it is a very happy time there at the Hall of Fame for inducting Willie O'Ree, it's also the same Hall of Fame that's going to put Gary Bettman in the Hall of Fame. The same guy, Gary Bettman, who is refusing to recognize CTE in the sport, putting a number of teams in the American South, and keeping them out of places in Canada with really rabid fan bases. And he's also the commissioner that is going to be looking over the application to come back to the league of Slava Voinov. In 2014, Slava Voinov pled no contest to allegations of domestic violence. He was suspended indefinitely by the league. The Kings voided his 6-year contract. He spent about 2 months in jail, did community service, and 3 years of probation. And he spent time playing hockey in Russia since he was booted out of the NHL. There is no domestic violence policy in the NHL, and so this is unilaterally going to be decided by Commissioner Gary Bettman if Slava Voinov is going to be allowed back into the league. Traditionally, the NHL, in a number of previous cases, has largely just waited to see what the court proceedings were and then used those to guide their work on these topics. That if a court case came back and said that the person was responsible, then the NHL would issue a consequence and issue a punishment. If a court case said that they weren't responsible or there wasn't enough evidence to bring charges, then typically the NHL has refused to go forward on any of those issues. And that's what we're looking at here. They're typically looking at court proceedings on these topics, and we saw the court proceedings. He pled no contest. He spent time in jail. He did 3 years of probation. Now that probation has expunged his record, he is asking to be brought back to the league. And there is certainly a case to be made that the league should have no quarter for people who have been involved in cases of domestic violence. There's certainly an argument that you can make for that. But as I've had the experience of talking to a number of people who have worked with domestic violence survivors, it becomes a bit more complicated matter, that the issues of a lost job or a prevented job can make things worse at home, that it can make things worse for them. And it's one of the issues why a number of people choose not to speak out, because it could harm their abusive partner's employment. The other issue in this for me is, has he acknowledged that his behavior was problematic? Has he pledged to change? Has he been involved in kind of educational components, therapy components, and taking responsibility and working on taking responsibility? Has any of that happened? And I don't know. It's not been made public information. And so it doesn't really seem like there's been much of a public mea culpa. There hasn't been really any kind of redemptive narrative that's been put forward about Voinov. It's just that he's asking to come back to the league. And this becomes this complicated matter because I would really love to see services provided for the survivor, in this case, his partner, but as well as Voinov. And part of that may be that it comes through the league. And to say that, he should be, he has a right to a job but doesn't have a right to an NHL job, yeah, it's certainly the case, and be very similar to what we argue with about Luke Heimlich, that you could certainly make that argument, but you could also make that case then that people who are coming forward may have that kind of chill in this, that the issues of a lost job can make things worse and make things more problematic. And it also could theoretically take away opportunities for therapy and other services to be provided to both Voinov and the survivor. And so to say that he shouldn't be allowed back in the league is one that is a bit complicated. And yeah, you can certainly argue he has other venues in which he can go still play hockey and make a lot of money, as he's been playing hockey in Russia for the last 3 years. Meanwhile, Leslie Smith in the world of mixed martial arts, the fighter who claimed that she was not renewed by Ultimate Fighting Championship over her efforts of unionization efforts, is having her claims going forward after Region 4 of the National Labor Relations Board had said that there is merit to her arguments that she was not renewed over her unionization efforts and not because of her fight record. She is alleging discrimination in her release, and she is also alleging that they are not independent contractors fighting at UFC, that they are actually treated as de facto employees. NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board, Region 4, has said that yes, there is merit to this case about unfair labor practices, and that it can go forward, as Smith had won 3 of her last 4 fights before her release. She was set to have another fight. They couldn't come to an agreement after she agreed to move a fight. That they couldn't come to an agreement after she had won these last 3 out of 4 fights, and they instead just released her and paid her as if she fought the last fight. This is likely going to be a slow process, as any kind of process is with the National Labor Relations Board. And who knows if a conservative government is going to affect the decision-making process here. Especially because National Labor Relations Board Region 4 has had the claim moved from Region 4 to the central office in Washington, D.C. And the National Labor Relations Board and unfair labor practices are always slow-moving cases. They're always taking a long time for things to get done. But it is heartening to see an unfair labor practice charge here taking action, and it's going to potentially be a big legal challenge to Ultimate Fighting Championship over unionization efforts, as well as the possible classification of UFC fighters as employees and not independent contractors. Because they are employees, they're not independent contractors. But we are going to close out this week with some very big, happy news. Josh Norman and Demario Davis of the NFL. Now, this should have, of course, gone in the football news section, but I really felt that we needed to close out on a positive, especially as we are sitting in a political nadir of a lot of instances of gendered violence that we've been talking about all show, and recognizing that it was kind of mansplaining, and that was largely due to some scheduling issues that we couldn't get guests that we would appreciating to have in studio due to some scheduling conflicts. So we hope to have them on in future broadcasts to discuss some of these topics. But in happy news for this week, Josh Norman and Demario Davis saw footage about these zero-tolerance policies that are really stupid, really horrible, really terrible, really dumb, and really bad that have been separating families. The Trump administration saying that they can put the families back together, but they've also said that they don't know how to put the families back together. And instead of having a case to figure out how they were going to do that this weekend, they decided to wait until Monday because the Trump administration's lawyer had dog-sitting duties in Colorado. So dogs are now apparently more important than people. Norman said, quote, "Put yourself in somebody else's shoes. They've got nothing, come here seeking asylum, know nothing of where they're going to other than that it's got to be better than where they were. Then you get to this place and they treat you like less than a dog." Quite literally. "We've lost our touch as a humanity. This is about the kids, so I never hesitated when the Lord said go." He partnered with the group Races Texas, the Refugee and Immigrant Center for Education and Legal Services. And he and his friend, Saints linebacker Demario Davis, joined in going down to Texas and buying toiletries, snacks, coloring books, and toys in a series of backpacks for a number of families. They filled up their entire hotel room, and because they had so much stuff, they couldn't fit it all in the hotel room. They went and dropped off the first batch, and then came back and brought more as more families were coming in. and made multiple trips buying toiletries, snacks, toys, and other gifts for these families. Norman, in being asked why he was doing this, said, quote, "I've been provided such riches and a great life, so why should I not help others? All of us have so much more than they do. Every one of us can be a hero. That's what the U.S. is supposed to be based on, not all of this hate and division," close quote. Davis followed up saying, quote, "We can all sit on social media and comment, but stop commenting behind screens. Take action," close quote. And taking action is something that is being done around the country. There were the Families Belong Together marches the last week of June. There were a number of protests. There are still protests happening in Portland. There was protests in Philadelphia. People pushing back on the zero tolerance policy, people pushing back and saying not in our name, and highlighting a number of issues about the world in which they want to live, and pushing back in the name of justice, in the name of righteousness, in the name of humanity, speaking truth to power. And that's always a powerful thing. It's always a heartening thing. And it's something we need to keep seeing as we move further and further in what appears to be the new political nadir. This has been Not Another Sports Show, NASRadicalSports.com, a radical look at the world of sports. Our show is available for broadcast on college and community radio stations, low-power FM stations, and in any of the over 180 network stations in the Pacific Radio Network.